thanks very much for inviting me to give this presentation. So as Mark said, I've sort of been back and forth working with the museum for quite a few years now, and this project the idea of this project was to have a look at the diet of giant pandas and their relationship with bamboo, and it was proved to be a very big project with a lot of partners. I was based Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh, but also spent quite a bit of time working with people at the Australian Museum and coming there, as well as working at a couple of different institutes in China and spending a lot of time out in the field. So the main reason that we became interested in giant panda was partly because of when the pandas were first brought into Edinburgh. There was an agreement made that we would do a little bit more research into it, and this was how the gardens became involved. Giant pandas have lost a huge amount of their habitat. They were historically throughout most of China, and it's actually only been sort of fairly recently that they became restricted into these high mountainous areas. So when we think of pandas having this highly restricted distribution, it's actually because there's humans inhabiting all the areas they would naturally be. So they're actually could be considered more as refugee species. They're only in these high mountainous areas because they're the only habitat that's left for them. And there's been, over the last few years, a huge amount of work in China and around the world to increase panda numbers. And this has been particularly successful in China, as many of you, I'm sure, have seen all the images of the hundreds of little baby pandas that are produced in these panda reserves in China each year. And the numbers are increasing and on the rise, but mainly in captivity. Out in the wild, that habitat is still quite small. And as the numbers in captivity rise, there's an increased idea now to release these back into the wild and increase panda numbers in the wild. Of course, if you're going to do that, then something really does need to be done about the small amount of habitat that's there. And so there's increasing work being done now to try and increase reserves and try and restore connectivity between these reserves, which helps quite often with a few other species. There's a whole range of groups that we worked with, looking at how other mammals and how species are being impacted by this sort of restoration work. The other thing about giant pandas is, of course, primarily their diet does consist of bamboo, and bamboo are quite unusual in that they only reproduce every 50 to 100 years. When these flowering events occur, the bamboos flower and they die back, and bamboos will flower en masse, so huge amounts of habitat. Food can be lost for giant panda because the bamboos flower and then die off. And this has happened on fairly smaller scales over the last couple of decades. And essentially, because panda habitat now is so small, the pandas which normally would have simply moved to another area can't do that anymore. And so we have large numbers of starving pandas if there's not quite intensive work done to try and artificially provide food for the animals. There's been research done quite recently looking at flowering events in bamboos and when they've occurred. And a lot of the research in many areas suggests that through interviews with locals, there's no living memory of flowering events in a lot of the species of bamboos in some of pandas' main habitat. So that's a little bit concerning because that means that probably for at least 50 years or more, there hasn't been these mass flowering events, which likely means there is one going to happen in the near future. And that really does need to be planned for. because there will be a huge loss in the panda population if those flowering events occur across vast areas of primary panda habitat. So the idea we wanted to look at was, what exactly are panda feeding on and how does this vary? So there's an obvious answer to that question. Pandas eat bamboo. And this is that well-known fact, but it is actually a little bit more complicated than that. We do know that pandas eat foods other than bamboos, and there's a whole range of different things that have been reported in their diet, both plants and animals. And certainly some of the more interesting and unusual observations have been those of pandas like this male panda you can see here. He's actually chewing away on the backbone and vertebrae of a takin, and takin are very large cow-sized goats. So there is definitely a whole range of other foods that make up a tiny part of their diet, but which could potentially be quite important in terms of their nutrition. So in this case, it's been hypothesized potentially this is a source of protein, but it may also be a source of calcium. And this male panda, this item that it's feeding on, so these large animals, they have been known to catch small animals, but for larger ones, they're typically feeding on carrion. So this carcass here, this was actually part of an experiment to see what carnivores were in the area. And this male panda actually sat for a good 4 hours gnawing away in front of this camera on this carcass. So they are definitely bears. They have the same digestive system as other bears. They should be omnivores, but they also have all of these specializations for bamboo. And what we don't really know, because we haven't yet got enough information, is to what extent these smaller, more infrequently fed on items actually have in terms of panda health and how important they are. There's a question that these sorts of observations may be more common in poorer quality habitat, or they may have something to do with nutritional needs at different times of year, such as breeding. We just don't currently have that information. We know from some other bear species that feeding on the barks of certain tree species is actually used as a sort of form of medication. So the same way cats and dogs eat grass when their digestive system is upset. And we do have a lot of problems in captivity of pandas having digestive issues. So there's a whole range of different questions that could be quite useful to know in terms of their ongoing conservation. And even when we look at bamboo, there are actually over 60 different species of bamboos reported across giant panda habitat. So it isn't that simple as pandas eat bamboo. And it does actually make a difference which bamboos they feed on. So you can see in this figure on the right, this is the amount of protein in a few different species of bamboo. And what you can see is that even the youngest shoots, which are typically the most nutritious of some species, still aren't as nutritious for a panda as the older shoots for other species. And we see when we look at what's known about panda diet, they pick some bamboos in some areas over others, and we don't quite know what the logic of this is. It has to have something to do with the nutrition, but we don't have a good idea of just how variable this choice is. Bamboos are also quite a complicated group of grasses, and while it seems that pandas can tell them apart quite easily, I certainly can't do it. These are 5 specimens that we've taken while we're out in the field. Because bamboos don't flower, we only have a fairly limited number of vegetative characteristics to tell them apart, which are usually to do with how the branches separate off from the stems, how far there is between each of these branches, and the cone sheath and how those appear. And actually in these 5, there are actually only 4 different species. And even with quite a bit of practice, I still struggle. I take a bamboo taxonomist everywhere with me out in the field. But these 2 are from the same species and these 2 belong to the same species. And when you know that, you can start to see these differences. But out in the field, it's incredibly difficult. And we also see a lot of variation in these characters, depending on the age of the plant, the habitat conditions, the soil conditions, which simply make just working out which species are in panda habitat incredibly difficult. So the idea of this project was primarily to work out what giant pandas were eating, but there were quite a few steps that we had to do before we could think about looking at that question. And the first of those being to try and develop some genomic methods and resources for telling different bamboo species apart, particularly once they've been quite heavily digested and the DNA degraded. And in order to do that effectively, we had to try and understand the relationships between the different bamboo species, how variable they were, and we also wanted to try and get some information that might help us work out the different populations of bamboos, which might shed a little bit of light on how far we can expect some of these mass flowering events to spread across the distribution. Because bamboos are really difficult to tell apart, the methods that we usually use for diet analysis just simply don't work. We can't tell the different bamboo species apart. So we spent quite a lot of time developing and testing different methods for DNA-based diet analysis of fecal samples before we could finally move on to the panda diet. And so for the rest of this talk, I'm only going to be talking about a little bit of the things we found in terms of looking at trying to identify the bamboos and tell them apart, and the types of bamboos that are in panda habitat, and then of course looking at the diet. So very briefly, we opted for using a targeted capture approach, looking at 500 different genes from a whole range of different bamboos that would help us ID all of those different species. And then for the diet, we took this same targeted capture as well as an associated capture that would target traditional DNA barcodes to have a look at some of those non-bamboo items in the diet. And of course, ran that through a whole range of bioinformatic processes in order to try and tell species apart and identify them in the diet. So when we first looked at the bamboos that we had samples for and that had been looked at previously in terms of identification and evolution, we actually found quite an interesting pattern in terms of where botanists were interested in going versus where zoologists were more interested in going. So this part of the distribution up here is the highest quality habitat for pandas. This contains the highest density of pandas across this distribution. So from our perspective, this is a really important area to be trying to understand what different bamboos are present. But as you can see, there's not many dots, not very many botanists have been up in this area. They all tend to focus down in these mountain ranges down here, which are part of the Henduan mountain ranges, which is a well-known biodiversity hotspot. So the botanists have been really interested in understanding the huge range and diversity of bamboos down in this area. And because these mountain ranges are a bit more recent, this hasn't been a focus. So we actually had to spend quite a bit more time going out into the field, and that's not a panda you can see crawling towards you. That's my colleague and bamboo taxonomist, but it is incredibly dense habitat. Trying to climb up the sides of mountains, you do start to feel a bit sorry for pandas sort of being forced into this when probably historically they were much more common in lowland areas than mountains. But after a few years of doing this, every couple of months each year, we finally got just over 400 samples of bamboos, which did cover over the 60 morphological species that have been identified. And we really targeted these areas that hadn't been looked at very much in terms of the genetics before. And in fact, a lot of the species that are in these areas were only identified and described in the mid-80s. So there's not been a lot of work done on the taxonomy of bamboos in this area. We also went through and rated some of the herbariums in the area to get DNA samples to include in our analyses. And thankfully, we did find that unlike some of the more standard DNA barcodes that are used and were failing to work with bamboos, our data set actually could tell apart all of the species that we expected to see. And while we could get quite good resolution for a lot of the species, one thing that you can see is that the current taxonomy isn't bad, but it's not perfect. We've got some very evolutionary divergent groups that are currently assigned to the same genera, particularly this Fargesia in here, which is very different to all the others. We've got two groups of Bashania that are very divergent from each other. And it's very hard to see. We included a whole range of different bamboos that came from Edinburgh Zoo, that are the ones they feed to their pandas. And they did think that they were feeding the pandas something very similar to what occurs naturally in China, which generally isn't these Phylostachys species, which are the cultivated versions. And the one and only species they thought was a close relative of what pandas would naturally be feeding on is actually a cultivar of a Phylostachys genus that someone has given the name Fargesia. So in Europe, pandas are definitely being fed on a very, very different and highly divergent group of bamboos to what they would naturally be feeding on. In China, we don't actually find any of these species occurring naturally in panda habitat. So I mentioned at the start that this area in the south was of great interest to the bamboo taxonomists, and we certainly find that reflected in a huge amount of diversity in terms of the different genera and evolutionary lineages that we see in this area. And this does start to drop off a little bit as we move into the newer parts of the mountain range, but we are still seeing a reasonable amount of diversity, although a lot of these more ancient genera are disappearing. When we work up into the areas that currently have the highest density of pandas, we tend to find predominantly these Fargesia groups. We have a huge range of species diversity here, which sort of equals the amount of species diversity we're seeing here. We just don't have the same level of evolutionary divergence and different genera. One of the slightly unusual patterns, which is supported in some of the other work that colleagues have been doing, this Bashania group actually only seems to occur in the south, whereas the alternate, quite divergent evolutionary lineages is actually only found up in the north. This was a little bit unexpected, but this species does seem to be showing a different evolutionary pattern to all the others, and this has been seen in a couple of other recent studies. And just to prove that you can never quite know and difficulties in identifying bamboo, one of the sites here where we identified one Yishania species, that species hadn't been recorded in that reserve before, despite habitat surveys occurring every 4 years. and that plant was actually right next to the research station. So they walked past it every day for who knows how many years. We thought it might have been introduced, but it's not known to have been there as far as anyone knows. It was native, and it does seem to come from something in the area. So there are quite a few unusual things that pop out of this. We also have some potential misidentifications or possibly hybridization, which isn't uncommon in these species, just to complicate the issue a little bit. Very quickly, our data set also did allow us to go and look at within species variation. So just from a couple of species that occur in this sort of northern region where there's a lot of pandas, but where there hasn't been mass flowering events really in the last, at least in the last 50 years. We do see for some of the groups, there are quite divergent groups occurring, not always quite where you'd expect them. We were sort of thinking they might occur more between mountain ranges where you can see rivers are present, but there's another biogeographical pattern happening here. As you can see, these green and blue are quite different from each other. And we don't always see the same pattern across different species. So the species has a similar distribution, although it travels, its distribution stretches a bit further south. But we don't have this break here. We have this, still have this break appearing between the green and the blue. And again, we have quite high similarities between groups either sides of rivers, and quite high divergence between groups that that the distance between is still similar, but there's something about the biogeography or geographic differences here that we're still trying to work out. Perhaps not surprisingly, one of the species populations outside panda habitat is again just as divergent as we're seeing within panda habitat. But not all of them show the same. This species, essentially, we get this decline in diversity. So their distribution is quite higher levels of gene flow between the different populations, with one exception of this pink one, which is incredibly different, and we actually suspect is either a misidentification or potentially a new species. So there's potential for some of these insights to help us, give us a little bit of direction in terms of how we might start to think about managing for potential future mass flowering events. But the main thing that came out of this was we could in fact tell different bamboo species apart. And so we could use this method to try and look at giant panda diet. So I'm just going to talk about one of the main sites that we looked at in this area. There's probably about 20 pandas in this area. And we had samples from about 50 different locations that were collected in about May. And we looked at several different things. So as I mentioned, we looked at those bamboo markers. We looked at standard DNA markers to look at things other than bamboo. Because these samples were recently collected, we actually also tried to have a look at mitochondrial DNA and SNPs targeting the pandas to see if we could tell them apart. And that was hopefully going to give us all the information we would need to try and get a better understanding of panda diet out of those fecal samples. So when we looked at the panda identification, we did manage to get mitochondrial DNA, so we could look at the different maternal lineages that were present, but all our nuclear SNPs did fail. We do know that the method does work. It worked through trials of fresh samples at the zoo, but simply the age of the samples collected out in the field, because they aren't that easy to find. So there's still a little bit of work that needs to be done there in terms of optimizing these types of methods to poorer quality samples. But in terms of the diet, we actually got data back from about 90% of our samples. And given I know of at least 4 of our samples that we looked at were easily over a month old, because at the point they were collected, no pandas had been sighted in the area for at least a month. But nothing else much eats bamboo, so these panda fecal samples stay out in the field intact for a very long time. Not surprisingly, we found quite a lot of bamboo, but about 4 or 5 of our samples, interestingly, had something else, and we used quite high thresholds to make sure that we weren't detecting environmental contamination. And what we found was evidence of Acer species, so maples, in the diet. And we went back to some of the samples and actually pulled them apart a little bit more just to try and confirm that. And you can see one of those samples here, and you can see this leaf that is not unlike an Acer species, is definitely not bamboo. And this was well and truly inside the sample. This was something that that animal had eaten. We also found, and they're a bit difficult to see, but these little balls, which we think are Acer seeds. And it may be that this panda has come across the Acer in flower. Seeds are also sort of part of human diet occasionally when people find them. So there is a potential source of nutrition there that panda might have come across. How much of that nutrition it's extracting, given that this is all still quite intact, is much more unclear. So even in a fairly small sample size in a restricted area of what is considered good quality habitat, we're still seeing a number of animals that are feeding on non-bamboo items. So there is definitely a need to try and understand the importance of these rarer items in the diet. And in terms of the different bamboos that are at our site, there are 5 different species that occur in various locations around the reserve, all of which panda are coming in contact with. When we looked at our fecal samples, it does appear that pandas are only feeding on 3 of these. And these are these Fargesias that are generally restricted to these northern parts of the range. We know in other locations the pandas actually favour Bashania, but for whatever reason here, potentially these species are at higher abundances at this time of year, or perhaps they're more nutritious. That work is still being done, but there is definitely a preference for some species over others. So we do need to think about what types of bamboos are being used and are appearing in restored areas to make sure that we are getting the levels of diversity that are useful for pandas as well as other species. And so now that we've got the method, we've worked this out, we've got quite a few trial sites where we've tested it, we've got an idea at these sites of what bamboos and what other things they're eating. We're hoping to continue this work into the future to try and pull this apart a little bit more, looking at how it varies right across the range, what this has to do with the availability and the nutrition of these different bamboos, and how panda decision making might come into this, and what time of year does it vary? Is it associated with additional need for certain things such as protein at certain times of year that's impacting on these choices? So it was a project that sort of went in many different directions that weren't necessarily expected at the start, but we have developed a whole range of next-gen sequencing methods that can help us better understand bamboos as well as the diet of giant pandas. And the bamboos in giant panda habitat are actually a lot more diverse and a lot more complicated than is generally given credit for. And we really do need to be a lot more conscious about thinking of these species not just as a single universal group where one is the equivalent of the other, because they simply aren't. And that we do need to keep in mind that it isn't just about bamboos for pandas. even in terms of their diet. There's a whole range of other things which could be quite useful to pandas and might be quite essential to their diet and their health. So there's been a huge range of people that have been involved with this project over 4 years, various groups that provided funding and in-kind assistance to us, as well as a huge number of people that came out with me in the field to try and help collect bamboos, particularly all the staff at all the different reserves, and even all the locals that helped us out from time to time, because the amount of local knowledge is just incredible. The people we met could tell apart different bamboo species that even our taxonomists really struggled to separate, because they have a day-to-day knowledge of these. They use them, they eat them, they cook them. They know a whole range of different bits of information that we often overlook. And very quickly, just to finish off, I have just prior to lockdown started a group using genetics at Fenner School at ANU, and so I'm going to be continuing a whole range of different things, including the panda work with colleagues internationally, but starting to work on some of our reintroduction projects, looking at the genetics, looking at the diets of animals to see how they're impacting on the existing environment, as well as looking at some conservation issues with sort of small population size. And now I'm back in Australia, really looking forward to continuing collaborations with the Australian Museum and getting back into some more taxonomy and collection-based type research, and working with everyone on koalas and various other things. So thank you.